On an ordinary Tuesday that felt like a verdict, my grandson lifted his eyes from a bowl of cereal and said, "With the clean cruelty only youth can manage, you haven't built anything that matters." The spoon froze in my hand. Milk beaded on stainless steel and trembled, the way cables hum just before a storm. 30 years of steel and river wind and night shifts, reduced to 7 words spoken between cartoon commercials and a math worksheet. It wasn't malice, it was ignorance, the kind that blooms in a world where things appear finished, delivered, invisible in their making. He lives in a city that stands because men and women refused to let it fall, where crossings feel as natural as breathing. To him, a bridge is a background. To me, it is a promise kept. I did not scold him. Anger would be easy, loud, and small. Instead, I let the silence lengthen, let it stretch across the kitchen like a span without false work. The refrigerator hummed. A delivery truck coughed somewhere on the street. In the thin light coming through the blinds, the steam from my coffee curled like a ghost from another life, one where I slept on site trailers, ate cold sandwiches with grease-stained fingers, and learned the river's moods better than my own. He kicked the chair leg. A careless rhythm. He doesn't know why my right hand sometimes hesitates before it closes, why I stand from a chair like a crane easing load, slow, measured, protecting the old injuries that never made the news. He doesn't know about the winter dawns when ice fog lay over the water and we tightened bolts with breath turning to frost, or the summer nights when thunder walked up the valley and we stayed in harness, counting seconds between flash and crack to judge distance. He does not know how many names I carry, men lost on other jobs, other rivers, so that I never forget the thin line between pride and obituary. I watched him and saw the chasm between us, an age of glass screens and instant crossings, and an age that trusted nothing until it held under load. His hair fell over his eyes. He pushed it back with a hand that has never lifted more than a backpack. Someday, those hands will be asked to hold something heavier. Someone's trust, someone's safety, his own word. No one tells boys that the heaviest weight is the one you put on yourself when you sign a drawing and the world builds from your lines. I set the spoon down and let it clink against the bowl. A small sound, but it felt like a hammer laid to rest. On the counter sat a battered lunch pail I can't quite throw away, the hinge stubborn, the handle smooth where 1,000 grips wore it honest. In the mudroom, a coil of old survey tape hangs like a faded prayer flag. In the garage, a dented toolbox sleeps beneath holiday decorations and a bicycle with tires that sigh. My name is stamped on the lid, dimpled letters from a time when stamping meant you intended a thing to outlast you. "How do you think the city holds together?" I almost asked. "What do you imagine carries you from one life to the next?" But I swallowed the speeches with my coffee. He needed less talk and more steel. The only argument worth making was a structure you can touch, the kind you feel in your ribs when a truck passes overhead, and the whole world vibrates but does not fail. I wiped the table with a dishcloth that smells faintly of lemon and old wood. The morning sun slid across the photographs on the wall, grainy shots of men in hard hats, a ribbon of river glinting behind them, a younger version of me half hidden at the edge because I never did stand close to the camera. My daughter once told me that I live like a scaffold, necessary, unsightly, meant to be removed when the show begins. She meant it kindly. She wasn't wrong. My grandson slurped the last of the milk and set the bowl down too hard. He glanced at me, gauging whether he had crossed a line. He hadn't. He had only pointed to one, the one I had been meaning to walk him across. I rinsed the spoon. The metal clattered in the sink, a note that sounded to my ear like a rivet set true. I dried my hands on my jeans and went to the hall closet. The old coat was there, heavy with winters. When I shrugged into it, the weight felt like memory settling onto bone, not burden, but belonging. Outside, the sky was the color of sheet steel before the first coat of primer. I turned back to him. He was already reaching for his phone, already drifting toward the day's small currents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't clear my throat. I simply let the decision sit in my chest, solid as a pier. "Get your coat," I said. No fanfare, no lecture, just 4 words and a door waiting. He looked up, puzzled, a little wary, the way anyone looks when ordinary breakfast turns into pilgrimage. He shrugged, stood, and pulled on his jacket. At the threshold he hesitated and grabbed the knit cap I keep for him on the hook. Good. Bridges teach you to think ahead. Wind, weather, sudden changes. We stepped out into a morning that smelled faintly of rain and iron. On the walk to the truck, I let him chatter about nothing. Scores, memes, a friend's new sneakers. Because I have learned that you don't fight the river. You read it. Then you choose your moment. When we reached the curb, I paused, listening to the city wake, to the tires on damp pavement, to the distant murmur of water moving fast where the river narrows. Somewhere beneath that sound is a heartbeat I know as well as my own. He climbed in and buckled without being asked. Progress. I turned the key. The engine caught. On the passenger door, a tiny smear of dried mud traced last week's rain. I left it there. Some things should not be polished away. He'll ask where we're going. He'll say he has homework. He'll complain about the cold, and I will let him. Because a good bridge flexes under load and returns to true. Because questions are wind, and wind is part of the design. We pulled away from the curb, and for the first time in years I felt that quiet, steady lift in my chest, the one that comes just before you step onto a deck you helped bring into the world, the one that has carried strangers safely home more times than anyone will ever count. He asked me again, softer this time, "Where are we going?" "To something that holds," I said, and we headed toward the river. Friends, let's take a short pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And has anything like this ever happened to you? A moment when someone questioned what you've done and you had to show them the truth? If this story speaks to you, please subscribe, share, and like this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep bringing you stories that matter. Now, let's continue. The garage was cold. The kind of cold that made the concrete floor feel like it was breathing frost up through your boots. Dust floated in the thin light that cut through the small window, turning the air into a slow silver snowfall. Against the far wall, half hidden behind an old ladder and a rolled-up tarp, sat the box. It was nothing special to look at. Green paint faded to dull gray, corners dented from years of being tossed into truck beds, stickers curling and yellowed with time. The handle's rubber grip had worn smooth where my hand had fitted 1,000 times. Hinges sagged, screws worked loose, but it still closed with that same tired click, like it remembered its duty. My grandson hovered in the doorway, hands in his pockets, shifting from foot to foot. He didn't know what was inside. To him it was just another piece of junk in a room full of things that didn't belong in the digital world he knew. But to me, it was a ledger, a record, a silent witness to the years when my life was measured in concrete pores, not in hours or likes. I knelt, and the familiar ache in my knees was there to remind me why the work had mattered. When I lifted the lid, the scent came first. Oil, metal, and the faint memory of rain-soaked job sites. Inside, everything had its place, though nothing looked new. The tape measure lay on top, its once bright casing scratched, the numbers on its steel tongue worn faint from 1,000 pulls and snaps. A small chip near the edge had been there since the night we were setting beams in a windstorm, and it slipped from my glove, bouncing off a girder before it landed at my feet. I'd kept it anyway. Next to it, a short carpenter's pencil, chewed almost to uselessness. I remembered holding it between my teeth while my hands wrestled with stubborn bolts, or marking quick notes on a beam before the rain washed the graphite away, and then tucked into a side compartment, the badge. The edges bent, the lettering faded, but my name still clear. I had worn it to every site, clipped to jackets and vests that smelled of dust and work. That badge had gotten me past gates, through inspections, and into the places where plans became steel and steel became something that could carry the weight of lives. I didn't have to explain to him what these things were. He could see they weren't trophies. No gleam, no glass case. But they were proof. Proof of mornings that started before the sun, of choices that cost me comfort but kept others safe, of nights I drove home with my hands too stiff to open a door without leaning on my shoulder first. I ran my fingers along the inside of the lid, where I had once scratched a single line during my first year on the job. If you're not proud to sign it, don't build it. He stepped closer now, curiosity pulling him in. He didn't touch anything, but his eyes lingered on the badge. I shut the lid, the hinges groaning like an old friend waking up. Then I lifted the box, the weight solid in my hands, the same weight I'd carried through decades of storms, deadlines, and the kind of pressure that doesn't give second chances. I didn't tell him yet where we were going. I just walked past him toward the truck. And for the first time that morning, he followed without a question. The attic smelled of dust and summers long gone. Each step up the wooden ladder groaned beneath my weight, sending little puffs of powder into the air. The single bulb overhead hummed faintly, casting light that didn't quite reach the corners. My grandson hesitated at the bottom, unsure if the climb was worth it. He'd never been up here, never had a reason to. But this morning there was a reason. I pushed aside a stack of winter coats in plastic bags and a box labeled "Christmas Fragile" in my daughter's handwriting. Beyond that, shoved against the far wall where insulation showed between beams, was a long cardboard box. The edges were soft from time, the tape brittle and yellow, as if the box had been quietly breathing for decades. It wasn't heavy when I dragged it toward the light, but it was dense with something weightier than steel. Memory. The flaps resisted when I tried to open them, sticking as if the years themselves wanted to keep their grip. When they finally gave, the smell rolled out. Paper, dust, and that faint metallic tang of blueprint ink that never really fades. Inside, the plans slept in tight rolls, bound with cracked rubber bands. They were survivors of rainstorms on job sites, coffee spills during late-night revisions, and the occasional boot print from someone not paying attention. The first one I pulled free was labeled in my own blocky handwriting, "South Span Final Draft." My name was in the title block, clear but slightly smudged where raindrops had fallen the night I'd signed off on it. I ran my fingers along the edge, feeling the tiny ripples where the paper had once been damp. I remembered that night. It had been just before a deadline, the rain hammering against the site trailer's tin roof, the wind rattling the walls. I'd stayed late, double-checking every calculation, because I knew that if I got it wrong, someone else would pay for my mistake in ways they couldn't return from. I unrolled the plan slowly, the paper cracking faintly after so many years curled tight. Lines and angles emerged like an old language my hands still knew how to read. Pier dimensions, load tolerances, the careful arcs of rebar placement that looked more like an artist's sketch than engineering. Every mark was a decision I had made, a risk I had measured, a promise I had put my name beneath. Behind me, my grandson finally climbed the last step, the boards creaking under his weight. He crouched next to me, his shadow falling across the blueprints. His eyes scanned the lines, but I knew he couldn't yet understand what they meant. To him, they were just drawings. To me, they were a map of the nights I had traded for mornings, the friendships forged in weather too harsh for comfort, the quiet victories no one ever celebrated but me. He pointed at my name. "You drew all this?" I nodded. "And they built it?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted the moment to stretch, to let him feel the weight of what he was holding, because it was more than paper. These plans had lived years in silence, tucked between holiday decorations and toys outgrown, forgotten by everyone but me. But they had always been ready, like the bridge they described, waiting for the moment someone needed to cross. I rolled them up again, slid them back into their cardboard coffin, and closed the flaps. My grandson didn't take his eyes off the box as I carried it down the ladder. The bridge wasn't just steel and bolts. It had been born here in graphite lines and coffee rings, in late nights and stubborn choices, and before the day was over, I was going to take him to see what those lines had become. He wasn't always the man in the polished shoes. There was a time we stood on the same muddy banks, both of us squinting into the sun, as we argued over where the first pier should rise. Back then, his hard hat was scuffed, his hands calloused, and his boots caked with the same clay that clung to mine. We shook hands with mud on our knuckles and grease on our sleeves. We were builders then, before ambition polished him smooth. It changed slowly at first. The boots got cleaner, the sleeves stayed pressed. He stopped bringing a thermos to site meetings and started bringing a briefcase. I told myself it was just the way things went. The younger men climbed the ladder faster now, and they wanted to stay dry while they did it. But then came the day he called me old school. We were in the conference trailer, fluorescent lights buzzing, blueprints spread across a table still gritty with dust. The city wanted a bridge that would last a century. I wanted to build one that would last two. The difference between those numbers wasn't vanity. It was steel, thickness, rebar density, things that no one would see, but everyone would rely on when the river rose angry. He leaned back in his chair, polished shoes crossed at the ankle, and tapped the corner of the plans. "You're too cautious," he said, like it was a flaw. "And you're expensive. We have to think about the budget." I told him the budget didn't matter if the structure failed. He told me it wouldn't fail. I told him the river didn't care about guarantees. From then on, the words "too cautious" became my shadow in every meeting. He started smiling more for the cameras, giving the speeches, shaking the hands of men in suits while I stayed on site, making sure the rebar was tied tight and the welds held clean. He knew how to charm donors. I knew how to read the wind by the way the crane cables swayed. And then came the bids. He invited me to review them, but by the time the papers landed on my desk, I could already see what had been cut. Safety buffers gone. Higher grade steel replaced with cheaper alternatives. My notes, dozens of them, were marked as non-essential in neat red pen. The phrase budget alignment became code for ignore the man who's been through enough storms to smell one coming. We were still partners on paper, but something had shifted. He was building his career. I was building the bridge. He saw my safety notes as obstacles, slowing the process, complicating his timelines. I saw them as the only thing keeping future headlines from turning into obituaries. The last time I tried to push back, we were standing on the nearly finished deck, the river rolling dark beneath us. He looked at me with that rehearsed patience, the kind you use with someone you've already decided to overrule, and said, "You've done enough. Let me handle it from here." And that was the moment I understood. To him, the bridge was a project to complete. To me, it was a promise I couldn't walk away from. He smiled for the cameras. I fought for rebar. And between those two choices, a crack began to form. Not in the bridge, but in the partnership we'd once believed could hold. City Hall didn't want calculations. They wanted a date. A shiny, marketable, press-ready date they could print on banners and repeat in interviews. Every meeting was the same, the mayor's office talking in headlines, PR consultants nodding along, someone from the finance department smiling while quietly cutting corners. The word integrity never made it onto the agenda. The bridge had become less about steel and more about optics. They wanted to be standing there with gold-plated scissors in hand before the next election cycle. The speeches were already drafted. The photographer was already hired. All they needed was for the concrete to dry in time for the cameras. But the river doesn't care about cameras, and Pier 3 didn't care about deadlines. I still remember walking that section on a gray afternoon, wind off the water slicing through my jacket. The sound was wrong, a faint, hollow vibration underfoot. I crouched near the base, tracing the welds with my fingers. The plans had been adjusted after I left the design meetings, and the reinforcement here was thinner than I'd specified. Maybe fine for a footbridge, not fine for 40-ton trucks and decades of storms. That night, under the hum of a desk lamp in my kitchen, I wrote the memo. It was short and precise. Add steel to Pier 3. Increase plate thickness by 2 millimeters. Recalculate load capacity before decking. No drama, no panic, just the truth, stamped with my initials. I sent it to every name that mattered. Engineers, city officials, contractors. The next morning, the project manager called me, not to thank me, but to tell me it had been reviewed. In bureaucratic language, reviewed means quietly buried. By the afternoon, it was officially marked as budget concern deferred. Deferred in this case meant never. I sat in my truck outside City Hall reading the email twice, the words blurring as my pulse hammered. They were trading safety for speed, certainty for ceremony. They were counting on the fact that, once the ribbon was cut, no one would crawl under Pier 3 to see what had been left out. I knew what this choice meant. I'd been on sites after failures, stood in the mud beside twisted steel, heard the rescue crews calling names into the silence. I could still remember the smell of wet concrete mixed with gasoline, the eerie stillness after a collapse, the awful truth that you can't negotiate with physics once it's decided to collect its debt. When I confronted him, the man in the polished shoes, he just sighed. We can't keep adding costs every time you get nervous. Pier 3 will hold. You need to trust the process. But I didn't trust the process. I trusted the math. I trusted the river to test whatever we built. And I trusted myself to know the difference between paranoia and prevention. This wasn't paranoia. This was a red flag so bright it could be seen from the far bank. That memo could have saved the bridge from its weakest point. Instead, it became just another piece of paper filed away where no one would look, until the day the river decided to remind them that my warnings weren't for show. And that day was coming. The first warning came in the smell. Anyone who's worked a river long enough knows it. When the air shifts from cold and clean to thick and metallic, like the water's been stirred from the bottom, it means something's coming. That night, the wind carried it ahead of the storm, and by the time the first fat drops hit my jacket, I knew we were in for more than rain. The sky dropped low and mean, the clouds hanging like a lid clamped tight over the valley. The cranes swayed, cables whining against pulleys. Barges, loaded with steel and concrete forms, groaned as they strained against their moorings, bumping and scraping like caged beasts. Somewhere in the dark, a loose sheet of rebar clanged, a metallic scream that cut through the roar of the wind. By midnight, the river was no longer a river. It was a living thing with teeth. Whitecaps rose and crashed against the piers like fists, spray leaping high enough to sting our faces. The half-born span shuddered, its skeleton catching the gusts like a sail. We moved along the deck in harnesses, bent low, gripping wrenches slick with rain, tightening what could be tightened, checking every joint that might give under the strain. Lightning flared, turning the world into a black-and-white photograph for an instant. Men crouched against the gale, the deck slick with rain, the cranes frozen in mid-sway, the barges rearing like startled animals. Then darkness again, so complete it felt like the river had swallowed the light. We didn't talk much. Talking meant opening your mouth to the wind, and the wind would steal whatever you tried to say. But in those glances we traded, through rain, through grit, there was a language we all understood. Hold. Don't let go. Don't let her take it. I checked Pier 3 twice, my boots slipping on the wet steel. The plates there were already flexing more than they should, the wind pressing the whole structure into a bow. I imagined what would happen if the load shifted just a little more, if one joint tore free. The thought made my gut twist. The storm didn't care about deadlines or budget lines. It didn't care about speeches or ribbon cuttings. It was testing us. Testing the bridge before we'd even given it a name. And in the face of that test, it wasn't management in their warm offices who answered. It was us, the ones out there in the harnesses, knuckles white, every muscle braced against the force that wanted to fold our work in two. Some men prayed aloud, their words lost to the wind. I prayed in silence, the way you do when your hands are too busy holding something that cannot be allowed to break. The steel groaned like an old ship, and I swear I could feel the river's pulse through my boots, a deep, steady thrum that said, I'll take what's weak, and I'll keep it. By dawn, the worst of it had passed. The wind softened, the rain thinned, and the cranes stood like weary sentries against a pale sky. We were soaked through, shivering, our faces raw from windburn, but the span was still standing. It was a victory, but not the kind anyone would clap for. No photographs, no speeches, just the quiet knowledge that for one more night, we'd kept the river's teeth from biting through. And deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last time it tried. There comes a point in every fight when you know which side of the line you'll stand on, even if it costs you everything. For me, that point came in a cramped conference room with stale coffee on the table and a row of faces pretending they didn't already know the decision they'd made before I walked in. The storm had barely dried from our clothes when they called the meeting. They spoke in calm, measured voices, sliding charts and timelines across the table, like the wind hadn't tried to rip the span from its foundations just nights before. Their focus wasn't on what we'd endured, it was on how quickly we could make up lost time. And then they said it. Skip the reinforcement on Pier 3. Skip the recalculation. Proceed as planned. I sat there, staring at the man in the polished shoes as he laid out the new schedule. His words were smooth, but underneath, I could hear what they really meant. We don't have room for your warnings. We'll take the risk. Only it wasn't their risk to take. It was the risk of every family that would one day drive across that bridge in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of a flood they never saw coming. And I knew, if I said yes now, I would carry the weight of that choice until the day the river took its payment in blood. So I said no, not with hesitation, not with qualifiers, just no. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. I saw the looks exchanged, the quiet notes scribbled down. They called it insubordination. They said I was standing in the way of progress. They hinted, ever so politely, that maybe my time had passed, that maybe the project had outgrown my old-fashioned caution. I told them it wasn't caution, it was conscience. They didn't like that word. It doesn't fit neatly into budget spreadsheets. The man in the polished shoes leaned back, folded his hands, and smiled in that way people do when they've already decided you're out. He didn't fire me outright, not yet. But by the end of the week, the message came through. My services were no longer required. The bridge would go on without me. So I turned in my badge. No ceremony, no handshake, just a dull clink as it landed on the HR desk. I packed my toolbox, still heavy with the tools I trusted more than the men I was leaving behind, and walked out into the sunlight. I didn't feel proud in that moment. Pride doesn't fill the space left by a job you've given decades to. I felt hollow, like something had been pried loose inside me, but I also felt clean. My name was intact. My hands, though tired and scarred, were clean of the choice they had made. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at my old blueprints. I traced the lines for Pier 3 with my finger, memorizing them again, as if committing a prayer to memory. If the day ever came when someone asked why I walked away, I'd have an answer. Because no job is worth building a bridge you know might fall. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have guessed, was that the bridge and I weren't finished with each other yet. The river would see to that. The day they opened the bridge, the sky was postcard perfect. Clear blue. A breeze just strong enough to make the flags along the deck snap smartly. From a distance, you'd think the whole thing had been blessed by the weather itself. But the river doesn't change for ceremonies. It still moved below with the same slow, steady power, waiting. I didn't stand with them on the deck. I wasn't in the line of hard hats and suits, smiling for the cameras. Instead, I was down on the far bank, where the grass met the rocks, far enough away that no one would recognize me unless they were looking for me, and no one was. Up there, the man in the polished shoes stood at the podium like he'd been born to it, voice amplified by speakers that sent his words drifting across the water. I caught pieces, words like innovation, partnership, vision for the future. All the clean, safe phrases that roll smooth off the tongue but carry none of the grit it takes to make steel stand against a river's will. He thanked the city officials, the contractors, the donors, the design team. He didn't mention the stubborn old man who had argued for Pier 3 until they showed him the door. In fact, he didn't even glance in my direction. Not that I expected him to. From my spot on the bank, I could see every joint, every plate, every line of weld on the underbelly of that bridge. My eyes kept drifting to Pier 3. Even with the banners fluttering and the confetti drifting down like slow snow, my mind ran numbers. Load distribution, wind shear, water pressure, and spring floods. Each rivet I counted was a prayer in disguise, one more bead on a rosary I'd been fingering since the day they cut me out. The speeches went on. They released a flock of drones to capture the event from every angle. Children waved tiny flags, the ribbons stretched tight across the entrance to the deck, and gold-painted scissors gleamed in the sun. Laughter and applause rolled over the water like distant thunder. I should have been angry. Maybe I was, a little. But more than that, I felt something heavier. A quiet grief. Not for myself, but for the bridge. For the way it had been rushed into this moment, dressed up for its debut, without the last measure of strength it deserved. When they finally cut the ribbon, the crowd cheered loud enough to drown out the river for a moment. People surged forward, stepping onto the deck for the first time, phones held high to catch the view. My view stayed on the waterline, watching how the current curled and struck at the piers, searching for weakness. The bridge had opened without me. My name wasn't spoken, my hands weren't on the rails, my boots weren't on the deck. But in the quiet between cheers, I thought I heard the river whisper to me. Not words exactly, just a promise. We'll see if it holds. And I knew the river always kept its promises. It arrived on a Tuesday, one of those gray, heavy mornings when the sky sits low enough to make you feel smaller than you already do. Bills, junk mail, a flyer for a grocery sale. And then, at the bottom of the stack, a thick, cream-colored envelope with the city's seal pressed deep into the flap. My name, written in careful, deliberate pen strokes, stared back at me like it had been waiting years to be used in that way. I almost set it aside. I'd gotten my fill of City Hall stationery, usually the kind that told me what wasn't possible, what couldn't be done, what was too costly to consider. But there was weight in this one. Not just in the paper, but in whatever had filled it enough to make the corners strain. I slid it open with my pocket knife and unfolded the letter. The first line stopped me cold. "We owe you an apology." I read it twice before moving on. It felt strange, that sentence sitting there on official letterhead, signed in ink. They laid it out plain. A review board had been convened after concerns were raised about certain aspects of the bridge's design. Someone, some stubborn, nameless someone, had dug through old meeting minutes, internal memos, stamped drawings. And there in black and white were my calculations, my warnings, my stubborn insistence on a margin of safety they'd once called unnecessary. They had ignored me, yes, but they hadn't erased me. The paper trail had survived, outlasting the politics, the ribbon-cutting, the headlines, and once it came into the light, it had spoken louder than any speech I could have given. The letter said the community had learned of it, too. People who drove the bridge every day. People who remembered the storms, the way the river rose and snarled at its piers. A petition had gone around, not a small one. Hundreds of signatures, maybe thousands. They demanded not just an acknowledgement, but a correction. And in city government, nothing moves faster than public outrage. The vote had passed. Unanimously, the letter said. That never happens. They were ordering additional reinforcement on Pier 3, just as I had recommended. Not as an afterthought, but as a matter of safety, as a matter of honor. And then came the part I read 3 times before I believed it. We will be casting a plate in your name to be mounted at the foot of the bridge. I leaned back in my chair, the paper still trembling between my fingers. It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't about my name etched in bronze. It was about the bridge finally having the spine it needed, the strength I had begged them to give it before the river had a chance to prove me right. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, light breaking through the clouds in thin, stubborn rays. I set the letter down and ran my hand over the old toolbox beside me, feeling the dents and scratches like braille. They had called me too cautious, too expensive, too slow, but now, months later, they were admitting the truth, though it took a crowd to make them say it. Some fights you win in the moment. Others you win long after you've walked away. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the victory comes with a bronze plate and a bridge that will stand 100 years longer than it might have without you. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it carefully in the top drawer of my desk. Not because I needed to read it again, but because someday my grandson would. He trotted beside me, his short legs making quick, determined steps to match mine. The air was sharp with winter, the kind that paints your breath in front of you and makes every sound carry farther than it should. His question came once, quiet, like he wasn't sure if he should break the silence. "Where are we going?" "To something that holds," I said, my eyes fixed ahead. I didn't explain more, because this wasn't the kind of answer you could hand over in words. This was the kind you had to walk to, feel under your feet, and see with your own eyes. We passed the old warehouses along the riverfront, their brick walls streaked with rust and rain. Gull cries echoed off the steel siding, cutting through the cold like the squeal of old hinges. The sidewalk sloped toward the water, and with every step the smell of it grew stronger. River water and oil and the faint tang of metal, the scent of my working years. He stayed close, his mittened hand brushing mine now and then, but never quite holding on. He was too old for that now, or at least he thought he was. The last time I'd taken him down here, he'd been half this height, gripping my thumb like it was an anchor. Back then, he'd been full of questions about cranes and barges, steel beams and welders. Now, his silence was the heaviest thing between us. The sun sat low, spilling pale light across the water, turning the surface into a shifting sheet of silver. The river spoke in the way only a river can, low, steady, certain. It hummed against the pilings, whispered against the rocks, pushed against everything in its path, with the quiet confidence of something that has never once lost. When we reached the embankment, I slowed. From here the bridge was just starting to reveal itself, a sweep of steel rising from the banks, its ribs catching the light. We walked under its shadow, the sound of cars overhead muffled by the structure's heartbeat, the faint, constant shiver of wind and weight moving through steel. He glanced up, craning his neck, his breath puffing white. "It's big," he murmured. It wasn't awe yet, not quite. More like the beginning of it before pride and disbelief collide. I didn't tell him my name was there, cast in bronze. I didn't tell him how much of my life had been poured into these beams. How many mornings I'd stood in this same cold light, wondering if the work would outlast me. He'd see it soon enough. Instead, I just kept walking, boots crunching over gravel, the river's voice in my ears. Because I wanted him to feel it first, the scale, the weight, the quiet power of something built to last, something that could stand against storms, against politics, against time itself, something that, whether he knew it or not, was as much for him as it was for the city. It wasn't in the center of the span where the tourists gathered for photos. It wasn't where the ribbon had been cut or where the speeches had rung out into microphones. It was tucked at the far end of the pedestrian walkway, where the steel met the concrete approach and the river stretched out beneath. The plaque wasn't flashy, no marble frame, no polished spotlight, just brushed bronze, warm in color but cool to the touch. The edges had been beveled smooth, the letters deep and sharp, the kind that would hold their shape for generations. It simply read, "My name, Chief Engineer, built with integrity after the storm." No politics, no sponsors, no mayor's name, just the truth, pressed into metal, meant to last longer than any headline. He stopped in front of it, squinting at first, then leaning in. His mittened fingers hesitated before they made contact, as though touching it might be something sacred. Then, slowly, he traced each letter, the way a child might follow the curves and lines of a prayer written long before he could understand all the words. I watched his brow furrow as he worked through the sentence. I could almost see the shift in him, the dawning recognition that the bridge he'd taken for granted had a story. And that story was not some faceless piece of history. It was his bloodline. "This is you?" His voice cracked in the cold air, the question trembling as much from the weight of what he was asking as from the chill. I looked at the plaque, at the reflection of the river flickering across the bronze, and then back at him. "This is us," I said. "Every hand that refused to lie, every person who chose the harder road instead of the quick one, every soul who believed that what we build should stand not just for now but for always." He kept his hand there a moment longer, his fingers resting in the groove of the letters. A gust of wind swept across the deck, rattling the handrail, and I felt the bridge hum faintly under our boots, a sound I had once heard from inside its ribs, in storms and in silence. And I realized something. This moment wasn't about the bronze plate, or even about the bridge. It was about him seeing the truth with his own eyes, about him knowing the cost of doing things right, and the worth of holding that line. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The river moved beneath us, relentless, steady, as if to say that some things, when built with care, belong not to the people who make them, but to everyone who crosses them. And in that quiet, I hoped that someday he'd have his own plaque. Not because of his name alone, but because of the way he chose to build whatever was put in his hands. We leaned against the rail, the cold seeping through our coats, the wind pulling at our words. The river carried the sound of traffic above us like a muted drumbeat, but my voice stayed low, as if speaking too loud might disrespect what had been given here. Bridges remember, I told him, not in words, not in pictures, Luca, but in the way steel holds its breath under a load, in the way rivets keep secrets. I told him about the men who stayed long after the sight lights should have gone dark, working past midnight with frost in their beards, their gloves stiff with cold, because they knew the next day's wind might bring another storm. About the women in the office who ran the calculations twice, 3 times, refusing to stamp the drawings until every number sang true. They were invisible to most, but without them, no beam would have met another in the right place. I told him about the crane operator, big man, soft-spoken, who missed his daughter's school play because the wind shifted suddenly, and a section of decking had to be steadied before it swung wild and tore a piece of the span loose. No one ever thanked him in the papers. They barely remembered to feed him that night, but the bridge remembered. And then I told him about the choices no blueprint ever shows. The day they wanted thinner plate to save a few dollars, the meetings where they talked about acceptable risk. I could have nodded along, saved myself the trouble, but I chose the thicker plate. It meant longer days, heavier lifts, slower schedules. It also meant losing friends, men I'd worked beside for years who decided my line in the sand was too hard, too stubborn. He listened without fidgeting, his eyes fixed on the water. Every so often a gust would whistle through the handrail and he'd glance at the rivets nearest us, as though trying to imagine the lives they'd lived. "Do they really remember?" he asked. "Everyone," I said. "They remember the weight they've carried. They remember the hands that set them, and if they're set right, they'll still be here long after we're gone, holding together what we left behind." For a while we stood there saying nothing, just letting the wind and the hum of the bridge speak for us. I thought of the storm nights, of hands raw from cold, of the smell of wet steel, and I thought of how all of it, every sacrifice, every argument, every quiet victory, was trapped inside these beams, silent but eternal. And maybe, just maybe, my grandson would carry that memory too. We were halfway across the span when I saw him, coming toward us with that same measured stride I remembered from every meeting, every press conference, every time he'd smoothed the truth into something more palatable. The polished shoes still gleamed, even in the pale winter light. His coat looked expensive, his tie perfectly knotted. And the smile, that smile, was the same one he'd worn the day he told me the bridge could live without me. But something had changed. He slowed when he saw us, recognition flickering across his face like a shadow. His eyes darted, not to me, but to the boy beside me. My grandson stared back at him with the frank, unblinking curiosity only the young can manage, the kind that strips you bare without saying a word. And in that moment, the man in the polished shoes faltered. His smile thinned, like it had to fight its way past something lodged in his throat. He extended a hand toward me, an offering, a performance, I couldn't tell which. The wind tugged at his sleeve, and for just a second he glanced down the span toward the far end, toward the plaque. He knew it was there, and he knew he'd have to pass it. I didn't take his hand, not out of spite, not out of petty pride, but because some silences speak louder than words. My answer had already been cast in bronze and bolted to steel for every person, every camera, every school tour to see. We stood there for the length of a breath, maybe 2. The river hissed beneath us, gulls crying overhead. He muttered something polite, empty syllables meant to fill the space, and stepped aside to let us pass. His eyes didn't meet mine again. As we walked on, I didn't look back, but I knew what he'd feel when his steps carried him past the handrail at the far end, when his eyes inevitably landed on those words. He wouldn't stop. Men like him rarely do, but he'd read it, and he'd know. Justice doesn't always wear a robe or bang a gavel. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's a line of letters carved deep into metal, a reminder that integrity doesn't wash away with time. Sometimes justice is nothing more than the fact that, no matter where he goes, he'll have to cross the bridge I built and see my name before he leaves it. It happened on a day without storms, without warning. The kind of cold, still morning when the river seems almost harmless, its surface smooth as glass. But anyone who's worked near water knows that's when it's most dangerous. From the walkway, I saw it before most people did. A barge, heavy and low in the water, drifting sideways with the current. No hum of an engine, no shout from a deckhand, just a silent, unstoppable slide toward the piers. At first, the pedestrians around us didn't notice. They were taking photos, sipping coffee, leaning over the rail to watch the gulls. But I knew the math before it happened, the speed of the current, the angle of approach. I could already feel where it was headed. Pier 3, the one I'd fought for, the one they'd called overbuilt, the one my memos had nearly cost me my career. When it struck, the sound was like a bell being rung by a giant's hand, deep, sharp, metal singing against metal. The vibration ran up through the rail, through my boots, into my bones. I felt my grandson grip my sleeve, startled by the shock of it. The span above us shivered. For a breath, the world held still. Even the river seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what the bridge would decide, to hold or to break. People froze where they stood. Somewhere a child began to cry, and then nothing moved. The bridge settled. The steel groaned once, low and deep, then went silent again, like an old soldier who'd just taken a hit and refused to fall. Pier 3 stood exactly where it was meant to stand, the water curling and foaming around its base in frustration. I could see crewmen on the barge scrambling to throw lines, tugboats spinning in from upstream, radios crackling with urgent voices. But my eyes stayed on the pier, on the thick plate I'd insisted on the cross-bracing they'd once tried to cut, on every inch of steel that had been set because I wouldn't sign off without it. My grandson's voice was small, almost lost in the noise. It's okay?" I nodded, but my throat was tight. "It's okay." What I didn't say, what I didn't need to say, was that the difference between okay and tragedy had been written in those sleepless nights, in the arguments behind closed doors, in the stubborn numbers I'd refused to bend. The reporters would call it a close call. The engineers would say the structure had performed as expected. But I knew the truth. This was the test no one scheduled, the one no press release had planned for, and the bridge had passed because, long before today, someone had fought for it to be more than just enough. We watched the barge drift away, tethered now, its threat gone. Life on the bridge returned to its rhythm, footsteps, laughter, the hum of traffic above. But for me, the sound of that impact would stay, ringing somewhere deep inside, a reminder that the things you fight hardest for will, one day, fight for you in return. The sun was dipping lower now, spilling gold across the steel, making every rivet gleam as if it had been polished just for this hour. The river caught that same light, turning from cold gray to molten amber, flowing steady beneath us like time itself. We had walked halfway back across the span when I felt it, small, tentative at first. His fingers curled around mine, not a casual brush, not the loose grip of a child being led somewhere, but a deliberate hold, sticky from the cold air, and maybe from the peppermint he'd been unwrapping in his pocket, but warm in a way that worked past the chill in my bones. I looked down, ready to see his usual expression of guarded curiosity, but his eyes were different now, softer, deeper, the kind that belonged to someone who's just glimpsed something bigger than himself and is still learning how to fit that feeling inside. "Grandpa, teach me," he whispered. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Those 3 words held more weight than any speech I'd heard at a podium, more than any plaque or ribbon or title. It was the kind of request that comes once in a lifetime, if you're lucky. We slowed our pace, our footsteps falling into rhythm. 2 sets of prints laid side by side on the deck I had once only imagined. When I'd fought for this bridge, I had pictured traffic, safety, a structure that would stand against storms. I had never pictured this, a boy's hand in mine, the echo of my own stubbornness and hope looking back at me through his eyes. I didn't build for applause. I didn't build for headlines. I built for crossings, safe ones, quiet ones, the kind no one thinks twice about because the bridge simply works. I built so mothers could push strollers across without wondering if the steel beneath them would hold. So workers could drive to their night shifts without fearing the river. So strangers could meet in the middle and pass each other without knowing they were standing on the sum of sleepless nights, aching backs, and unshakable standards. And now I realized I had built for him too, for this walk, for this moment where something wordless passed between us. The understanding that real work isn't just what you create, It's what you leave behind for others to carry forward. The city would forget my name eventually. The bronze would weather, the steel would age, the stories would thin, but the bridge would stand, and maybe years from now, he'd bring someone else here. Maybe he'd lay a hand on that same plaque and tell the story in his own way. Maybe he'd fight for his own Pier 3, whatever shape it took. As we reached the far side, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of the river and the faint, metallic hum of the span beneath us. He didn't let go of my hand, and I didn't let go of his, because in the end, what we leave that lasts isn't just steel and concrete. It's the hands that hold after us, the quiet victories walked over by millions without fear, each step an unspoken thank you to those who built not for glory, but for trust.